Hi Reddit. I never thought that one simple lottery ticket purchase would change my life so drastically, and at the same time shatter all my illusions about my family. I live in the Netherlands, in a small town near Utrecht. I work as an ordinary office analyst, not poor, but not rich either, enough to live comfortably without worrying about every little thing. But my relationships with my family have always been complicated. My relatives, they're the type who always know how to make you feel guilty. My Aunt Margaret is a tough and calculating woman who constantly compares me to her kids and my cousin Jens, who, according to her, always does everything right. Uncle Peter loves to play on emotions, reminding me of his sacrificial acts and how much he's done for me, even though in reality he only saw me a couple of times a year. And there I was, sitting on a Friday evening checking the usual lottery email that I bought more out of habit than hope of winning. I never thought the universe would surprise me like that. On the computer screen, the message flashed. "Congratulations, you've won the jackpot." My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I reread the numbers several times, compared them to the ticket, did the calculations, and yes, it was true. Over 3 million euros. At first I sat motionless, feeling a mix of shock, joy, and disbelief. Then I started shaking. This was a real sum, enough to buy a house, a car, invest in dreams. And no one could take it away. I felt incredible relief, as if all my years of saving and modest living suddenly made sense. But the joy didn't last long. Within a few hours, the first calls from family came in. First, my mom, her voice soft but with a clear note of expectation. "Congratulations, son, on this win," she said, pausing. "You know the family is always there for you, right?" I felt a slight anxiety. The family is always there, I thought, only when they need something. The next call was from Aunt Margaret. "Well, now you can help our kids with their studies, and Jens with his startup. Of course, just a portion, a reasonable portion." And that's when I realized one thing. The win opened the door for the whole family to make their demands. At first, I tried to be polite, explaining that I wanted to think it over, but my voice betrayed growing impatience. They expected me to hand out the money right away, as if it was rightfully theirs. I remembered all the years when I was the youngest in the family, always overshadowed by others' achievements. Jens with his career, my cousins with their university successes, and Aunt Margaret with her endless comparisons. There was never praise, never support, just demands and criticism. And now, when I can really change my life, they suddenly remember me and want a piece of the pie. That evening, I lay in bed thinking about what to do. On one hand, the money was a chance to make my life comfortable and finally feel free. On the other, family pressure. They always knew how to make me feel guilty, and now it seemed like that game was starting over, but on a whole new level. The next day, I met with my best friend Thomas, who has always been honest with me. I told him about all the calls and manipulations. "Listen," he said, "they never cared about you, and now they expect you to become a bank. If you give even €1, they'll demand more. This isn't family, it's predators." I nodded, but inside I felt mixed emotions: anger, betrayal, but also anxiety. After all, I grew up thinking family were people you could rely on, and now it turned out they only saw me through the lens of my bank account. And then I got the first official request, a letter from Uncle Peter. "We hope you'll share the win. Families should support each other, especially in times like these. We await your decision." I sat reading it, feeling everything inside me tighten. This was the moment I realized. The win wasn't just joy, but a test of my strength, boundaries, and ability to say no to people who were never there without self-interest. The following days turned into real psychological hell. Every call, every message, like a little attack. Mom started sending photos of kids, reminding me of happy moments. Jens talked about his investment ideas. Aunt Margaret hinted at family pride and duty to kin. I tried to find a middle ground. At first I thought, maybe help a little, at least morally, give advice, suggest. But the more I communicated with them, the more I realized this wasn't help, it was constant pressure and manipulation. I started keeping a diary, recording every request, every hint. And the more I wrote, the clearer the picture became. They never valued me as a person, only the opportunity to get money. And at the moment when I almost broke, I decided I must protect myself and my boundaries. It wasn't revenge or cruelty. It was understanding that money can destroy not just the family, but the person themselves if boundaries aren't set. And that's when I realized the real story was just beginning. Because when I say no, they won't just accept it. They'll fight, manipulate, and try to break me emotionally. And Reddit, this is exactly the moment when I wonder, AITA if I don't share the win with greedy relatives. The day after the first letter, I woke up feeling like it was all turning into a nightmare. You'd think a win should bring joy, but instead, it became the start of an emotional tornado. I tried to focus on work, on ordinary analyst tasks, but every call, every notification on the phone was like a lightning strike. Mom called every couple of hours. Sometimes her voice was quiet and timid, as if she was afraid of me, sometimes sharp, almost accusatory. Do you understand that family should always support each other? Do you really want us to suffer? I felt anger building inside, but also guilt. Memories of childhood, when parents sometimes praised me, intertwined with the current situation where they showed only greed and manipulation. Aunt Margaret sent a long message on WhatsApp. We all know you won, and we think it would be fair to share it with loved ones, especially considering Jen's recently lost his job and the kids are in university. You understand this is a moral duty, not just a request. I reread the message several times. Every word was calculated to evoke guilt. Moral duty. They really thought they could make me feel responsible for their own mistakes and oversights. I tried to explain to them that the money was my property, that I earned my peace honestly and wasn't obligated to fulfill their desires, but every conversation turned into manipulation. Jens called excitedly. Bro, imagine I could double that money through the startup. I'd make sure you profit too. And that's when I felt the trap. They weren't asking for help for themselves. They were trying to pull me into their financial games. Every message, every call started eating away at my psyche. I began noticing I was becoming irritable, nervous, and often daydreaming about just disappearing. But disappearing was impossible. They knew my address, knew where I worked. That's when I decided, record all conversations and keep a diary of every contact. I wanted to see the whole picture without emotional distortions. Every letter, every call, everything was documented. I started noticing patterns, manipulations, threats of silence, complaints about family suffering. But the worst happened a week later. Uncle Peter came to my house for coffee, even though I hadn't invited him. His face was smiling, but his eyes betrayed his intent. He started talking about how family always supports each other, that a real relative never refuses loved ones. I stood listening, feeling panic rising inside. I understood. If I say no now, they won't leave without an emotional war. And that's when I first thought about boundaries. I remembered the years when parents ignored my successes, when Aunt Margaret criticized everything I did, when Jens tried to outdo me. And now they're back, demanding money, manipulating feelings. Inside me, two people were fighting, one wanting to keep peace and calm, the other tired of manipulations and ready to fight back. I realized the money had become a tool, and I needed to decide strategically, or they'd crush me morally. I started thinking about a plan, how to keep the money but protect myself from constant pressure. I contacted a financial advisor to transfer the win to a separate account, discussed possible legal protection from any claims. But the relatives' emotions were too strong. Mom sent a message full of teary emojis and words. We always thought you understood us, but it seems you only think about yourself. I sat reading that message and for the first time felt real freedom. They can manipulate, but they can't make me feel guilty if I don't allow it. The following days were torturous. Every day I got new arguments, new complaints, new hints at my duty to family. But I started responding shortly, calmly, not letting emotions control me. And the more I responded that way, the clearer I understood. I can stand my ground even if they think I'm selfish. After a month, the situation reached its climax. Aunt Margaret and Jens came to the house under the pretext of discussing the situation in person. I invited them into the living room but clearly set boundaries. No requests for money, no threats. The conversation was tense, and at some point I realized they don't understand that money isn't just numbers, it's my personal control and independence. And that's the moment, Reddit, when I wondered, AITA, if I don't share the win with people who were never there without self-interest. But the story didn't end there. On the horizon appeared an unexpected twist that turned everything upside down. Threats of lawsuits, family secrets, and psychological games I hadn't even suspected. A few weeks after the tense meeting with Aunt Margaret and Jens, the situation moved into a new phase. They realized verbal manipulations weren't working and decided to resort to more active measures. The first signal was a letter from Uncle Peter's lawyer, formal, cold, but with a clear threat. We are forced to consider legal ways to obtain a portion of the win, as we believe you are obligated to consider the interests of closest relatives. I reread the letter several times, and inside me awoke a mix of anger and disbelief. This was the first real attempt at pressure, not just with words, but with the law. At that moment, I realized this was no longer a game. It was a real battle for my right to dispose of my money. My first reaction was panic. I wasn't used to conflicts at this level. But then came a rational thought. If they try court, I need to be ready. I called my financial advisor and lawyer, described the situation in detail, provided all call recordings, letters, and contact diary. And that's when the real emotional pressure began. Every morning, the phone rang with new messages. Mom crying in voice notes, brother Jens writing that it's all for the family, Aunt Margaret forwarding old photos and letters from childhood, as if trying to evoke guilt. Sometimes their words were so precise it seemed like they knew every fear of mine. But now I was armed. I was no longer a child. I controlled my emotions and had evidence. A month later, Uncle Peter, not waiting for a response, showed up with the whole team of relatives. They came with the idea of peaceful settlement, but it all looked like a psychological assault. Everyone tried to speak at once, accusing me of selfishness, of undermining family values, of life being short and needing to share joy. I sat and listened, recording every word. Then a thought flashed inside me. They don't see me as a person, they see money. And that realization became the turning point. I did what I'd never done before, stood up and said, "The money is mine. I never asked for it to hurt anyone, but I'm not obligated to give it to people who have manipulated me my whole life." The words sounded sharp, but they finally heard. I saw confusion, anger, and bewilderment in everyone's eyes. Some left, others stayed, as if trying to find a loophole to continue the pressure. The following days became a real psychological war. I received letters, calls, messages, all at once. And that's when I understood. My family was trying to turn the win into an emotional weapon. Every step of theirs was calculated to awaken guilt and force me to submit. And here, Reddit, came the unexpected twist. One day, I received an anonymous email. It contained information that some relatives were hiding huge debts and loans, as well as old court cases I knew nothing about. I reread the letter several times. If this was true, any decision to share the money could turn into a legal nightmare. And that's when I realized, not just my moral stance, but the safety of my funds was at risk. I decided to act strategically. Instead of entering open confrontation, I began preparing legal defense. consultations with lawyers, opening an independent trust for the one funds, transferring to international accounts. I understood this was the only way to protect my interests. But the psychological pressure didn't ease. Mom wrote a long letter almost with tears on paper. "We were always there, even if you didn't see it. Why can't you share the joy with us? You're destroying the family." I reread the letter and for the first time felt no habitual guilt. I understood. Their manipulations weren't the truth about my choice, but a tool of control. And that's when the unexpected moment happened. My younger cousin, Lily, who was always quiet and observant, called herself. She said she didn't agree with the other relatives and wanted to support me. Her words became a symbol for me that not everything in the family was lost. A few days after her call, I felt I could take a step toward ending the conflict, but on my own terms. I invited all relatives to a meeting in a neutral place and notified them in advance that the conversation would only be about the future, without pressure, threats, or manipulations. The conversation was tense, but for the first time I felt in control. I spoke calmly, citing facts, references to laws, and my conditions. Some tried to argue, but I didn't let emotions take over. And at the end of the meeting, I said, "I value family, but money can't be a tool of pressure. I'm ready to support you within reasonable limits, but not under conditions of manipulations and threats." And read it for the first time in a long time, I felt relief. This was my step toward personal independence, protecting my psyche and finances. But the story doesn't end here. The next part will tell about an unexpected lawsuit, society's reaction, and the consequences of my decisions, which will completely change my family's attitude toward me. A few weeks after that tense meeting with relatives, when I set clear conditions, came unexpected news. Uncle Peter filed a lawsuit. He claimed that I unfairly bypassed family interests, and that a portion of the win should, in their opinion, be distributed among relatives. I remember sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, rereading the documents. First panic, then anger, then strategic thinking. Court isn't just a test of laws, it's a psychological battle. And I understood. They're trying to continue emotional pressure, only now through official channels. My lawyer was adamant. "We'll win if all documents and evidence are in order, but be prepared that they'll use any means to hit you morally." And they did. The first court hearing became a real spectacle. Uncle Peter and Aunt Margaret brought witnesses who told how I allegedly intimidated the family and that the win should be divided fairly. I sat opposite, calmly listening and making notes. At the second hearing, my lawyer presented all the documents, correspondences, letters, call recordings, and financial reports showing that I never promised to share the win and that relatives tried to manipulate me. The judge listened attentively to both sides. Sometimes it seemed like every glance from the court fixed not just facts, but the moral side of the story. Relatives tried to evoke guilt, but my evidence was ironclad. Meanwhile, the story started gaining traction on social media. An anonymous post on Reddit with details of the conflict went viral. People wrote, "You did the right thing. Money isn't a weapon." I wouldn't share with relatives who try to manipulate either. Comments supported me, and at the same time gave a sense that my moral position wasn't unique just to the family. Public opinion became a powerful moral shield. But the psychological pressure didn't disappear. Mom kept calling, sometimes with threatening tones, sometimes with complaints. Every call caused an internal conflict, sense of duty, guilt, and desire to defend my rights all at once. And here came the unexpected twist. During preparation for the trial, my lawyer discovered that some relatives were hiding information about large debts and financial schemes. If I'd shared the win, I'd have had to bear responsibility for their problems. This discovery became a moral and legal trigger for me. I realized, not just justice, but the safety of my funds was at risk. I shared this information with the court and lawyers. On the day of the final hearing, everyone expected an emotional explosion. Relatives came hoping public pressure and guilt would help, but I stood calmly, with documents and facts, speaking confidently. The judge, after hearing both sides, made an unexpected statement. Based on the provided evidence and financial reports, the plaintiff has no right to a portion of the win. Decision in favor of the defendant. Whispers filled the hall. Relatives were stunned. For me, this was a moment not just of legal victory, but moral. I protected my rights and showed that money shouldn't control relationships. After the court, life changed. Relatives gradually backed off, most lost interest in the conflict, leaving only minimal contacts. Mom wrote a long letter admitting that her emotions and pressure were mistaken. I realized one important thing. Real family isn't just blood ties, but respect for boundaries and personal freedom. Money opened my eyes to people who seemed close, but in fact used me as a tool. Despite all the drama, I didn't become bitter. On the contrary, I became more attentive to real friends and people who supported me unconditionally. Winning the lottery became not just a financial victory, but a symbol of my independence and willpower. And in the end, Reddit, I understood. Sometimes the real value isn't in money, but in being able to say no to those who try to use you, even if they're relatives. After the court, calm set in. Relatives gradually backed away, and I finally felt I could breathe deeply. But along with relief came a sense of emptiness. Money gave freedom but showed who was real and who was only there for gain. I started keeping a diary to process all the emotions. In it, I recorded every meeting, every threat, every manipulation attempt. It was a way not just to organize thoughts, but to realize my own strength. I understood that I often let others' expectations control me, even when it came to family. Several months passed, and I decided to use part of the win not for luxury, but for myself and people who really supported me. I set up a small fund for friends who needed financial help, and also for a local charity organization. This was my way to give back good to the world that had been used against me. But fate prepared another unexpected twist. On one gray autumn day, a distant relative I never really saw called, Aunt Hannah from the neighboring country, living in Germany. She said she'd been following the trial the whole time and saw how I defended myself. "I always knew you were brave and honest," she said in a trembling voice. "Most of our relatives, they lost you in the chase for money. I want to meet and get to know you better." This call awakened a strange feeling in me. I didn't know if I should trust, but something inside told me. Sometimes relatives can really be different if given a chance. We arranged a meeting in a neutral cafe in Berlin. When I entered, she stood up, smiling, and extended her hand. Her gaze was honest, without hidden motives. We talked for several hours, discussing the past, family history, our dreams. For the first time in many years, I felt that someone from the family sincerely saw me for who I am, not through the prism of money or manipulations. This meeting became a turning point. I understood that real restoration of relationships requires not just defending boundaries, but the ability to distinguish sincere intentions from greed. A few months later, I started gradually rebuilding relationships with other relatives who didn't participate in the court drama. Some were cautious, some suspicious, but I no longer felt obligated to submit to others' expectations. Money was no longer a tool of pressure. My life changed not just financially, but emotionally. I became more confident, learned to say no, and to value people who stay by your side unconditionally. I started posting my thoughts on Reddit, sharing experiences on how to deal with manipulations and toxic relatives. Comments and personal messages from people around the world showed that my story resonates and helps others find strength in themselves. And then the last surprising event happened. A few years later, I learned that Uncle Peter and Aunt Margaret went through financial difficulties and faced a crisis they previously wanted to shift onto me. But instead of revenge, I decided to act differently. I helped them, not by giving money directly, but by consulting them, showing how to get out of the debt pit honestly. They were stunned. My help was sincere and impartial, and it changed the dynamics of our family. I was no longer a puppet in their hands. I became independent, strong, and confident. So Reddit, the moral of this story is, money shows who is really with you for relationships and who for gain. The ability to defend your boundaries isn't selfishness, but protection of mental health. Forgiveness doesn't always mean loss of control. Sometimes it's a path to your own strength. Since then, I live peacefully. I haven't forgotten the lessons of the past, but I no longer let toxic people control my life. I learned to distinguish true intentions and value real connections. Winning the lottery was not just a financial victory, but a symbol of personal freedom and willpower.